Welcome back to Oberg Guitar Studio. That is the composer's workshop studio, classical guitar lessons studio, recording studio, and guitar building studio. We do it all here at Oberg Guitars. So anyway, today I want to talk about my method of tuning the classical guitar. I've been to a few concerts lately where the player, who most recently, incredibly accomplished player, really was not a decent tuner, and that meant the entire concert he was out of tune. So I know there are plenty of players who have a really good method of tuning, but I also know there are a lot who don't. So I'm hoping that even if you don't use my method, that somebody out there is going to be able to take advantage of even just a little nugget of the method to help them in achieving a good tuning. So the method is different than anything I've seen, but it's not really very difficult to learn. And one of the most important things to have a grasp on in learning the method is some of the basic principles of the physics of vibrating strings. And I want to move kind of quickly through this so that we can get to the method. But first of all, I'm going to talk about the modes of vibration of a vibrating string, the nodes, the harmonics, and the beats. So what happens when you strike a string is it's excited into motion, and the very first mode of vibration gives us the fundamental note, which is the basic lowest pitch that you hear, like the open E string or any note that's fretted with that pitch name. That's the fundamental. So it's the most simple mode of vibration. At the same time, the string is separating into all of these different equal vibrating sections of smaller and smaller fractions. So at the same time that it's vibrating and giving us the fundamental pitch, it's breaking into two sections and giving us an octave harmonic. We'll talk about harmonics in just a second. It's also breaking into 3, 4, 5, and 6 sections ad infinitum, continues breaking down into smaller and smaller, equally vibrating sections. So what's happening is the first harmonic, now the difference between a harmonic and an overtone is that the fundamental is not an overtone. So the second harmonic, or the octave harmonic, is the first overtone, which is where the string is breaking into two equal parts and there's a single node in the middle, right in the middle of the two equal parts, and that gives us the octave harmonic. So it's the octave of the fundamental pitch. The octave pitch is the first harmonic. It's the second harmonic. The third harmonic is the octave fifth, and this is where the string is breaking into 3 equal vibrating sections. When it breaks into 4, you get the double octave. When it breaks into 5, the double octave and a third. It breaks into 6, the double octave and a fifth, etc., as it continues to break down. Now you'll see here on the double octave that the center lines up exactly with the octave harmonic. So it's a little tough to hear the double octave harmonic because this is a louder harmonic, but it's in there. So anytime there's a mathematical relationship, an equal mathematical relationship with another section of the vibrating string, then those notes will appear in the same place, and I'll explain that when we get there is another place where several other places where this happens, most notably with the double octave fifth here. So I'll demonstrate that for you just briefly here. The fundamental, of course, is your basic low pitch. Now, before I continue demonstrating this, I want to talk just quickly about beats. If you think of a note, a vibrating string, as having assuming a simple waveform, of course we know that it's more complicated than that, but if it did have a simple waveform and you struck another note that was slightly out of tune with it, then that waveform is going to be staggered relatively. This isn't a really great graphic representation of the concept, but hopefully you'll get the idea. So when that second note is slightly out of phase with the first note, it sets up what are called beats. This is something we hear as a pressure differential in our ears. So it has this literally a beating sound, and I'll be demonstrating that when we get to the next chart here on intervals. So to get back to this, so the fundamental is your basic note where the string is splitting into two equal sections, right in the middle gives us the octave harmonic. So that's an octave higher. That pitch is an octave higher than the fundamental. So that is this E, the second fret on the fourth string, is this pitch. Okay, so that's two sections. When the string breaks into three sections, you get an octave fifth of the low E. So that happens to be at the seventh fret. Now you know that there are three of these sections. So if that's one, you can even visually see that the next third, since it's breaking into three sections, is going to be at the 19th fret. So the 19th fret and the 7th fret are the same pitch, which is the octave fifth of the low E. So if this is an octave, then a fifth is going to be the B above it, which is the open B string. Same pitch as that. So now when you're breaking into 4 seconds, you get the double octave, which is at the 5th fret, and then if you can visually see this distance right here, then it's about there. There's no real landmark down here, so the other one is inside here. It's vibrating in there, but because the octave harmonic is so loud, we can't hear it very easily. The next one is where it's breaking into 5 equal sections, and this gives us the double octave third, which is just behind the 4th fret. So we know if there are 5 sections, then I should visually be able to go up approximately that distance and find it. So there it is. And then again, right there. So that's about a fifth of the string. The next one, there, and there. And then you could continue on up, and they get a little harder and harder to find, and they start actually getting a little inharmonic relative to what their natural mathematical proportion should be to the fundamental. But that's basically the concept there. So now we've covered this idea of the harmonic series that each string is creating. So when you strike 2 strings together, and in my method we're going to be using 4 different intervals to listen to, and those intervals are the octave, which I don't have drawn here on the chart, the 4th, the major third, and the 5th. The octave, the fundamental pitch of the upper note, and the octave harmonic of the lower note are the same pitch. So those are the notes you'll be listening to see if they're setting up a beat. We talked about beating. So I've been tuning the guitar for 50 plus years, and I also have a background as a piano tuner. So one of the things you learn to do in piano tuning is listen to a string, a vibrating string, and pick out all of the harmonics that are ringing along with the fundamental. So you develop this skill of selective listening so that you can pick out individual pitches and see what that note is doing relative to the same pitch that's occurring on another note. And that's represented right here, for example, in the interval of a 4th. The open E string and the open A string share a harmonic. They have the same harmonic in their harmonic series. And with a 4th, the coincident harmonic, it's referred to as coincident, is an E. So that's the double octave of this note. So you have the fundamental octave, octave fifth, double octave, which is another E. And then on the A string, it's the octave fifth. So you have octave, octave fifth. So they share this particular harmonic. Now with the major third, I've notated it an octave higher because if I started here, I would end up with too much ledger lines up here, too many ledger lines. So this is notated an octave low. With a major third, the double octave third of the G and the double octave of the B string are the same harmonic. They share a B. And likewise with the 5th, they share a B also. The open 6th string and the 5th string 2nd fret B share this B harmonic. So that's the octave 5th of the low E string and the octave of the B string. So I want to talk just for a moment about equal temperament, which explains to some degree, at least basically, why it is these are not in tune. Within an octave, equal temperament divides the octave into 12 equal semitones, 12 equal pitch distances between each adjacent semitone. So it's the same as from one fret to the next on a guitar. On a piano, it's a white to a black key or a black to a white key, or in the case of B to C and E to F, a white to a white key. The distance is the same with all of these semitones. And that distance is divided into 100 cents. That's C-E-N-T-S. And I'll explain why that's important in just a moment. In equal temperament, in order to allow for modulating through the keys and have all of the intervals the same, these intervals that would otherwise sound more pure like they do or would in just intonation have been compromised. So with the interval of a fourth, this, for example, if this were the reference pitch, the low E, this E harmonic here on the fifth string is stretched a little bit. This is tuned a little bit sharp of what would give a pure interval here, what would make a unison between those two notes. On the fifth, the interval of the fifth is shrunk a little bit. So this B would be tuned down a little bit to make the interval narrow, a little bit narrow relative to what would create a unison between these two notes. The major third is also a stretched interval. So stretched, stretched, narrowed. This particular interval, the major third, is really stretched. So it's stretched between 13 and 14 cents. That's like between 13 and 14% of the distance between one note and its adjacent semitone. The distance of its semitone, 13 to 14%. So that's a lot. And you can hear this, it's really quite dramatic. So I want to demonstrate this to you, actually, the major third. The major thirds are beating in this open position at about 7 beats per second. The interval of a fourth in this open position down here is beating at about 1 beat per second. And a fifth is beating at approximately 3 beats in 5 seconds. So this equates to the sound of more like a roll, like a slow rolling beat. This one you can count pretty well. This one you can also count. It seems like 7 beats per second is a lot. It begins to sound kind of like a flutter. But in piano tuning, you end up developing the skill of listening to, up to 10 to 11 beats per second. So 7 beats per second sounds something like so I know if it sounds like that it's too fast, and if it sounds like da 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 da, it's too slow. So there are checks, and we'll go through that so you can kind of hone in on roughly where that 7 beats per second is. But just to demonstrate how basically bastardized the major third is in equal temperament, I want to play the difference between an equally tempered third and a just intonation third, or a third where these two coincident harmonics are in tune. So this is roughly an equally tempered third. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's vibrating at about daga 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 daga. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the B down until I'm at a just third, or bringing these into tune, these two harmonics, and you'll hear the sound of a just or a pure major third. So I'm going to start tuning the B string down. So that's roughly it. There's some other stuff going on because of the open B strings. There's some sympathetic vibration that they're picking up, but it actually has a very beautiful sound. Pretty close. So now I'm going to bring the B string back up and stretch that interval away from these two harmonics being in tune until I hear roughly 7 beats per second, and that will be an equally tempered third. So I'm going to start raising the B string. That's roughly it right there. So if I check the octave is good. So that's about where it needs to be. Now if I go back to tuning these in tune rather than being stretched where it needs to be in equal temperament, and then check the octave, you'll hear the octave is way out of tune and it's beating wildly. So there's roughly a just third. Here's the octave. It's going wah, 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 wah. It should be going faster, which means I didn't go down far enough to get to the pure third. Not like that. There, ba, 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 ba. Needs to be about there. I'm bending the string to get to where the major third should be. But here's where it is. With a pure third. With these two harmonics in tune. Okay, so I'm going to raise the B back up to an equally tempered third. Right about there. So the octave should be quiet now. And it's in tune. Okay, so that's the major third. The fourth, we know that the fourth needs to be stretched a tiny bit, approximately 1 beat per second. So if I were to tune these two notes in tune, these two harmonics, make these two harmonics in tune right here, the coincident harmonic in this interval, it's not going to be equally tempered. And if you tune all the way up using this method, you're going to compound the air and you're just going to end up chasing it. You're going to get these in tune, and then by the time you get to, say, the G string or the E on the fourth string, you're going to realize it sounds a little flat, and you'll start tweaking it, and pretty soon you're chasing it, and it's... You may be able to make it work, but I can't. Okay, so what I want to do is tune these so they're quiet, and then we'll check the fifth and the octave. Okay. It's a really slow roll coming around. Let's say for all intents and purposes that's quiet, and that these two notes are in tune, the coincident harmonics on the fourth. So there's no beat. So if this interval is too narrow, and we know that the fifth is an interval that is narrow already in equal temperament, then it's going to be a little too narrow, and it's going to be beating too fast. Those are in tune. Here's the fifth. You can hear that beating. And it should not be beating. The fourth should be quiet because it's not stretched wide enough to introduce that beat. And it is quiet, it's not beating, because we tuned the harmonics. So that shows you right there that that's beating at about wah, 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 wah. See if you can hear that. It's beating on that pitch. And here's where it needs to be. I'm going to stretch it a little bit with my finger over here. It needs to be quiet like that. So you can see how tuning these notes in tune is not going to give you a good tuning. So now we need to introduce a little bit of a beat in the fourth by raising the pitch of the A string, just a touch. Right now it's beating about bum, bum, bum. It should be a little bit faster, but let's check the fifth. See, the fifth has gotten quiet. The fifth is not beating now. And now the octave check. I think it's still just a tiny bit flat, but we'll leave it there for the moment. So you can see that with a beat, I've introduced a beat here. The fourth is no longer a quiet interval. In other words, these are no longer in tune because it has to be stretched. And the fifth is quieter, because it should have a beat that's like 3 beats in 5 seconds, just a slow roll, and the octave is in tune. So that's the first part of the video, the introduction to using intervals and the theory about the vibrating strings and everything. So in part 2 we're going to go through the method, and I'll show you how to move across the strings along with all of the checks. And once you get a grasp on it, it actually goes pretty quickly. It's pretty amazing, and you start to hear more. You'll start to hear more things that you didn't hear before, and you start to get a much cleaner sound to your playing. There are some other factors involved, like compensation, what has the maker done with the saddle, fret placement, string tension, the player's technique, the action height, etc., etc. And we'll discuss all that in the next video. That does have an effect on tuning. But for the most part, okay, so this is part one, and I'll see you when we reconvene for part two.